We've been in the midst of a series called Fables for Families. We've been looking at some of the things that hang us up as we're in our family relationships, not just your immediate family, but maybe your work family, your extended family, your friends at school, all those kinds of things. How we deal with anxiety is part of that. And to do that, we've been using some stories from the Bible, like the one that you heard here earlier, and also some fables. These are kind of parables to help us get into thinking about this morning. So I have a story to tell you, and it's time for story time with Pastor Bob. Here we go. One hot summer evening, Mrs. Brown was straightening her house. A spider, whose name was Miss Mary Muffet, spun a perfect web in the corner of the ceiling. An immaculate web containing absolutely regular polygons. Ms. Muffet was not immediately aware of the excellence of her work. As she waited for her prey, she finally saw the perfect symmetry of her web. No web had ever been spun like this before. She had finally achieved perfection. Naturally, none of her children had the same exacting eye for perfection of symmetry in a web. So obsessed was she with her virtuoso performance that she spun a parallel web so that she could observe the perfection of the first web from all possible angles without disturbing it. Just at that moment, then, the web caught a fly. Usually this would be a good thing for Ms. Muffet, since the tensing of the web was like the ringing of a dinner bell. But the fly was messing up perfection, and an angry Miss Muffet would have none of it. She approached the terrified fly, who knew that his doom was sealed, but then impossibly she cut him free to fly away. The fly was incredulous and yet grateful. Then a couple of mosquitoes upset the web. They were freed by Ms. Muffet in a similar fashion. All night she fixed onslaught after onslaught. Every bug that hit the web was cut loose, and the web was repaired again to perfection. Early the next morning, Mrs. Brown came into her kitchen and noticed the spider web in the corner of the ceiling. She went to remove it, but noticed that the spider was dead. In her night of toiling for perfection, Ms. Muffet had starved to death. Ms. Brown pondered for a moment before sweeping away the once perfect web. Then she turned her attention to the dishwasher and wondered why no one in the family could ever seem to load it correctly. A lot of what we've been talking about in this series is about anxiety, how it permeates our families and organizations, and how it manifests itself in reactivity. We've talked about how we deal with anxiety, either by thinking through it or reacting in what Edwin Friedman calls a reptilian way. Remember, we have different parts of our brain. That reptilian part of our brain is the fight or flight concept. And if you think about it, reptiles, or spiders, if you will, not in the same family, but similar disposition, they're not generally cuddly, are they? Not playful creatures. They're very serious. For example, you might notice that you can make a horse prance or you can make a dog dance, but you can't really play with a snake or have fun with a spider. Anxiety brings out the reptilian nature in all of us. And one of the most reptilian of regressions is the trap of perfectionism. Perfectionism, at base, is really about fear, anxiety about the world around us. Now, I want to give you some of the symptoms of perfectionism and the fear that underlies it. I don't know if this is going to relate to any of you this morning, so we'll see here how it goes. Okay, one moment. The first is fear of failure. Perfectionists often equate failure to achieve their goals with a lack of personal worth or value. Secondly, fear of making mistakes. Perfectionists often equate mistakes with failure. In orienting their lives around avoiding mistakes, perfectionists miss opportunities to learn and grow. Next is a fear of disapproval. If they let others see their lives, perfectionists often fear that they will no longer be accepted. Trying to be perfect is a way of trying to protect themselves from criticism, rejection, and disapproval. All or nothing thinking. Perfectionists frequently believe that they are worthless, that their accomplishments are not perfect. Perfectionists have difficulty seeing situations in perspective. For example, a straight A student who receives a B might believe, I am a total failure. All or nothing thinking. An overemphasis on shoulds. Perfectionists' lives are often structured by an endless list of shoulds that serve as rigid rules for how their lives must be led. With such an overemphasis on shoulds, perfectionists rarely take into account their own wants and desires. No sense of humor. In their reptilian, manic state, they become very serious about getting things done. And then lastly, perfectionists tend to believe that others are easily successful. Perfectionists tend to perceive others as achieving success with a minimum of effort, few errors, emotional stress, and maximum self-confidence. At the same time, perfectionists view their own efforts as unending and forever inadequate. So you'll see perfectionists work like mad to achieve some goal, hoping for recognition by someone, either a parent or a teacher or a boss or a peer group. They'll seek that recognition as a means of gauging their worth. At the same time, the paradox is that the harder they work, the less healthy they become. They are starving to death. Anyone? Anyone? I won't ask you to raise your hand because a perfectionist would never do that. You don't want anyone to know that you actually are one. But it hits home with me. Big time. Confessional. I'm an adopted child, and psychologists say that often adopted children will go one of two directions. Either they'll believe that they're unwanted and they'll live that the rest of their lives, or they'll overachieve to try to prove their existence. I tend to be in the latter category. It's been one of my lifelong pathologies to try to prove that my existence is not a mistake. When I was in kindergarten, now I started to read when I was 4 years old. I was sitting in a restaurant starting to read the menu. It was great. So I had a quick mind as a child. And when I went to kindergarten, I was acing everything. I aced kindergarten, baby. Took it out. But we had the weekly reader every week. Anybody ever remember the weekly reader? Some of you remember the weekly reader. Well, you did the weekly reader, but the best part of the weekly reader was the back page where they had like an exercise you had to do. And you would do that and you'd turn it in. And the teacher, if you did well, would put a smiley face on there and put a star next to your name on the chart. I was nailing this. Till about 2/3 of the way through the year, one weekly reader day. I don't know what happened. Clearly not my fault. But I got a frowny face. A frowny face on the weekly reader. I lost it. I dissolved in tears. The teacher had to call my mother because I was inconsolable. I joined Little League, which is a great place for a perfectionist, And I pitched. And when I pitched, I had to strike everyone out. And if I didn't do that, I would get very angry. And it was in one game, I was 8 years old. And I remember I'm painting the corners. Fastball is just working. I'm painting the corners. And the umpire's just like ball, ball, ball. And I walked like 4 guys in a row. And I got so angry at the last walk that I threw my glove at the umpire and got run from the game at 8 years old. When I went up to bat, I needed to get a hit every time. If I didn't get on base, it was a problem. Forgetting, of course, that in baseball, if you get a hit 3 out of 10 times consistently, you will make it to the Hall of Fame. It's a game based on mistakes, but you couldn't tell me that. So I left baseball and went into music, where I picked the drums, where you have to be the one who is meticulously on the beat for the entire song. Can't mess up with that. Got to be perfect. And then after high school, I joined the Army. That is a place for perfectionists. They love perfection. And they will tell you when you don't achieve it, which they did often. In school, I needed top grades. Graduate school, seminary. I'm studying to be a pastor. But I get an A minus. It's a problem. It's a problem. It's a relentless drive to make sure that everything is done flawlessly, believing unconsciously that my worth was tied to my performance. I don't know if this is relating to anybody out here. Anyone? Yeah. That's why I can relate to the story of Mary and Martha. Now, this story has a lot of meanings, and depending on your perspective, you could identify with either one. Jesus shows up at the house, and Martha automatically moves into perfectionist mode. Her worth is bound up in what she can produce. Now, notice in the story, Jesus has not asked for anything to eat. Hey, Martha, you got anything in the cupboard? No. He is not looking for a meal, but he's going to get it whether he wants it or not. You ever been in a house like this? My grandma was like this. Didn't matter if you were hungry. I'm not hungry. Well, you can eat a little something, right? You're going to get it one way or the other. Mary, on the other hand, sees an opportunity to relate to Jesus, and she doesn't squander it. Everyone would have expected her to be in the kitchen too, because she's a woman after all, and in that culture, it would have been scandalous for a woman to be seen and heard in such a situation. Martha, in her reptilian fashion, reacts out of her anxiety. She's worried about appearances. Jesus, tell my sister to get in here and help me. Because if the meal goes bad, she's thinking, it will reflect badly on me. She'll not meet Jesus' approval. She'll feel horrible, and she'll try harder, and the cycle will continue. Jesus says, what's better? What's better? Mary is willing to sit and listen, to relate. See, Mary doesn't care that much about dinner. She knows what's really important. She's got Jesus in her house. Perfectionists have skewed goals, and they often focus intently on unimportant things. Meals, clean houses, perfect grades, as a way of not dealing with their own feelings of anxiety. Perfectionists believe they are in control, but the reality is, like Ms. Muffet, they're caught in their own web. And that issue of perfectionism then begs the question, what's really important? Sure, we all want to do our best and do what's good, but at what point does our desire for perfection block out what's really important? The relationships and the self-differentiation that ultimately bring us to health. Ms. Muffet starved to death because in her reptilian perfectionism, she forgot what was really important, her own health. Because the purpose of a web, after all, is to capture food it's not for looking at. What's the purpose of our lives? To make perfect grades? To keep an immaculate house? To be at the top of your profession? To make your kids perfect? No. It's not what we were created for. God creates us in His image. He creates us out of love and creates us for the purpose of love. That's the heart of the gospel. We are loved by God so that we can love others. We are blessed so that we can be a blessing. God does not expect perfect performance, but perfect love. Love for God, love for others, and love even for ourselves. Remember, that's part of the Great Commandment. We don't have value in God's eyes because we do everything perfectly. We have value because God created us out of love and for the purpose of love. Perfectionism is really a form of love hunger. And if you or someone you love is caught in that trap, what can you do? Well, the first thing is pretty simple. We've been talking about it through this whole series. Remember, first, that the only person you can manage, the only person you can control is you. If you're starving from perfectionism, you need to realize that recognition and validation generally does not come in proportion to your work. You can spend those extra hours at the office at the expense of your family. You can yell at the kids to keep the house clean to your standards. You can do all the extra credit problems, but at the end of the day, no one really cares that much. I mean, when was the last time someone asked to see your high school transcript? College? No? No one cares that much. Do you believe that all your manic work and busyness is going to matter that much in the end? I've done a lot of funerals over the course of 30 years. One thing I could tell you is that people who live to work, who live for perfection, don't leave a lot behind them except bitterness and regret. As the old saying goes, no one on their deathbed wishes they had spent more time at the office. So don't forget, the only person you can control is you. You can choose to be different. Secondly, don't forget your purpose. We were created as human beings, not human doings. God loves you as you are and wants you to grow in that love. We don't do that by cranking out more righteous activity, but by simply sitting at his feet. You may have gotten a message as a kid that you were responsible for the weight of the world, that everything depended on you, that you had to perform flawlessly in order to be loved. I'm here to tell you and remind myself today, that's a lie. It's a lie. You are loved because God loves you, period. Period. You are loved with an everlasting love by the God who made you. Not so that you could be a worker drone who simply does God's bidding, but you are a person of sacred worth in whom God desires to live and to work. Now, this message might seem odd to be preaching in a church in the Wesleyan tradition. Because I don't know if you know this, one of the key doctrines of the Wesleyan side of the church, our tribe, is the doctrine of Christian perfection. And you're saying, okay, Pastor Bob, you've just thrown out everything you've said. Our doctrine is Christian perfection. Well, we misunderstand what we mean by perfection. We misunderstand perfectionism in general. John Wesley put perfection this way, Christian perfection. He says, by perfection, I mean the humble, gentle, patient love of God and our neighbor, ruling our tempers, our words, and our actions. Notice, it's not about perfect performance. But what's it about? Perfect love. The love of God ruling in our hearts, shed abroad toward others. It's not about what we do, it's about our attitude, our intention. We believe the Christian life isn't so much about how perfectly we perform, because we know we can't do it perfectly, but about how perfectly we learn to love Jesus, to love others, and love ourselves. And the more that we're able to do that, the more our actions come in line with that love. The purpose of our lives isn't to be perfect, but to be perfected by the grace and love of God. As a perfectionist growing up, we went to catechism, did all those kinds of things, went through the church, memorized the Westminster Shorter Catechism in the Presbyterian Church, all those kinds of things. But when I discovered Methodism, when I became a youth pastor at a Methodist church, I read John Wesley and I realized here's a guy who's a recovering perfectionist. If you read his journals, you would not have wanted John Wesley as your pastor. He was very meticulous about everything. But one day, May 24, 1738, he went to a meeting on Aldersgate Street in London where he heard someone reading about God's grace. It changed everything for him. He realized he could never be perfect by his own efforts, but that God loved him anyway and was leading him on a journey toward becoming more and more like Jesus. Wesley realized that his sins were forgiven and his life was made new. And his story gave me hope for my own. Because I still wrestle with this. I mean, just today, I know I'm preaching on perfectionism, okay? I get up this morning, I realize I'm going to go preach a sermon on perfectionism. I get in the car, and I start driving here, and immediately I get behind someone who's going 20 miles an hour in a 35-mile-an-hour zone, tapping their brakes every 50 feet. Trying to get here on time, my own time. Nobody else is here. Trying to get here on time. So I get here, we come in, we're rehearsing for the morning, and the monitors aren't working right. And poor Matt in the back is like, I can't make him happy. I'm losing my mind. I can't hear what I'm supposed to do. Preaching on perfectionism. Today, right now. I'm still working on it. Still working on it. But I've come to realize that when you get outside the reptile, that because of God's love for me, because of God's love for you, God's unconditioned, unearned, unbounded love, it doesn't matter. None of this matters. I don't have to prove myself anymore. I've learned to be more like Mary and want to sit at Jesus' feet. That doesn't mean I don't do my best, but it means that God values me more than what I produce. You hear that? God values you more than what you produce. And I find that when I have that kind of love as my motivation, my performance is actually better with less stress and more passion and compassion. See, when I fail to sit at Jesus' feet, when I get up in the morning and I get into a manic way of getting to work and getting things done, and I fail to stop and take that time to really recognize God's presence in my life, that's when the lizard takes over. But when I allow Jesus to speak, it invites me to choose the better part, things go a whole lot different. So we got two stories this morning, two contrasting types of Marys. There's Miss Mary Muffet, whose perfectionism starved her to death. Well, Jesus invites us to come to the table, to leave our perfectionism behind, to come and sit with him, and enjoy the bountiful meal of his love. Well, we didn't earn it. He gave it for free, out of love. His love broken, poured out for us on the cross, and given to us in this holy meal. And if we do that well, we remember that, then we can be like the Mary who sits at Jesus' feet, who shows us how to come and partake of the better part of Jesus' love and grace, because no one can take that from us. It's his perfect love, and you don't have to be perfect to receive it. I hope you hear that today. May we receive his grace and the gift of his love. He loves you where you are right now and wants to make you whole. Thanks be to God for his grace.